Replacing an Integra mainboard.
Hello, I am Tony Roach, Training and Field Service Representative for OPW with the Integra tank gauge. Today we would like to talk about the steps involved in changing a mainboard in the Integra console. As we can see, this one is out of order. The screen is not as it should be. It's not showing us our inventories and delivery histories and things like that. We've already discussed this with tech support and have concluded that we need a new mainboard. Before we start, the most important thing we need to do is safely remove the power from the unit so that no one gets electrocuted. So of course we're going to open the unit and turn the power switch off. Now, since we can't access the Integra program itself, we have no choice but to allow the unit to shut down on its own. And that will be normally in about 8 minutes because our battery will hold it running that long. So now we've waited about 8 minutes and everything's shut down. You can see that we have no LEDs on, so we know that the unit has powered off. Our next step would be to go lock and tag out the breaker feeding this console, because we do have power coming in on this strip which feeds this power supply. So we will go put a lock and tag on the breaker and continue with our removal. Okay, we have our breaker locked and tagged out, so we know we don't have any power on these units. Where we begin to do this safely is we'll remove this cover from the power supply. And it's pretty straightforward. You have 3 screws holding it on. It is imperative that we have the breaker turned off before we remove this cover, because there are some components that are mounted right up to the edge of our power supply, and it's almost impossible to remove this cover without shorting against some of those components, and you could end up having to replace a mainboard and a power supply instead of just a mainboard. So we get the screws out, and we'll have to just kind of move it out a little bit. We generally have some wires that we have to push out of the way, and we clear. And now we can see the reason we had to take the cover off. The mainboard power supply to the mainboard, is hardwired in at the mainboard, so we have to unplug it off of the power supply. And once we pull that plug, we can now proceed to just the removal of our mainboard. Once we have our lockout tagout installed and we're ready to proceed, the first thing we need to do is remove the internal barrier if we have one. Now that's pretty easy to do. It's a 5/16 nut on each side of those. We can generally just get them loose. If we had room over here, we could actually use a nut driver. So we've loosened those up, and we can just take them off with our fingers. Be careful not to drop them. Then the barrier will just slide out, and we should have enough slack in our wires to let it slide. And we can just go ahead and unplug it from the board and lay it aside. Now, once we have the barrier out, we can see the screw that was being hidden underneath the barrier. And we have 5 screws. We have one here, one in the bottom center, all the way over to the left and the top left. Those are 5 screws that have to come out in order for the mainboard to be removed. Now, before we take the screws out, we can go ahead and take everything loose. We can remove the CF card, set it aside because we will reinstall it in the new mainboard. The USB key, once again, we'll install it in the new mainboard. And this little component right here, that's what we call the Dallas chip, or the ESN. And this is married to this board, so we have to remove it and install it in the new board as well. That's where we get our licensing. Right, so we can unplug our battery. And then if you'll notice, the power supply actually is hardwired into the mainboard and plugs into the power supply. So we take that loose at the power supply. These wires right here, That is our Petronet communication going over to the V-Smarts that we do have at this location, and it's just a plug as well. We can simply just unplug it. You can see we have some jumpers here. I have never had to change any of those. They come set at the factory, so I wouldn't expect that we would have to do anything with those jumpers. This unit happens to have a modem installed, so we would remove the modem, lay it aside to install in the new mainboard. Now we have 3 additional cables that we have to take loose. The first one that I'll talk about is this multicolored cable. That is our VGA cable for our display. We've had a lot of those get damaged in the field by technicians just reaching in and grabbing the wires and pulling them out. There's a little notch right here that we can put a little screwdriver in and kind of twist it and pop that connector loose. We had one to match it on the top so that that connector comes out without having to pull those wires. Trust me, that will save you a lot of headaches in the future. We have this cable right here is actually our touch screen, and it has a locking tab on the back side of it, which is real easy to get. You just reach in and you push it with your thumb and it'll lift right out. It should be almost zero force to unplug this. If you have to tug on it, then you're not releasing it with that locking tab. Then of course we have these 4 little black wires. That is the backlights for our display. And we can just kind of wiggle those a little bit and they'll pop right out. Now one of the things, and this catches me a lot, on the outside, we need to make sure that anything that we had plugged in on the outside is taken loose as well. And now we're ready to actually remove the screws and take the mainboard out. And from this point, it's pretty straightforward. The older units have stainless steel screws, which are non-magnetic, so you need to be careful that you hang on to them as you come out. The newer units, we have changed those to a galvanized screw, which is magnetic. So we had the 3 screws at the bottom. And you see, told you drop one. Two screws at the top. Now there's nothing holding the board up there when the screws are removed, so make sure you get a grip on it before you take out the last screw or it will fall. And then we simply lift the board out. And we have now removed our mainboard and we're ready to put the new one in. So we have moved our failed mainboard and we're going to install our new board now. And of course, the installation is the reverse of removal. So we simply walk our board in. Remember, we have 5 screws. I generally start with the easiest one to put in. Don't tighten any screws completely until you have them all in case we need to move the board around a little bit to align screws. Once all 5 screws are in, go around and just snug them up. There's no need to put a great big torque on them, just snug them down. Then we have to reinstall everything that we took loose. We have our Petronet communication to our V-Smarts, plugs in. We have our backlights. You get it started, and then you can just reach in with your fingers and push the sides of the connector, please, to make sure that everything's seated. We have our touch screen, which snaps in very easily. Then once again, we have this multicolored cable, and we have to use extra care when we're installing this. What we've seen multiple times is this white wire right here will get broken from technicians grasping it like this and just forcing it in. And what they do is they push this white wire against the edge of the connector, and it just breaks. These are really small wires, and there's no field repair for that. You'd have to order a new part. We do give you the part number on the tag for that cable assembly, 20-1637. So we get the connector started. Come on around there. And then once again, we use our fingers on the very edge of the connector to make sure it's seated all the way. Now, normally I'll take my little screwdriver, the same one I removed it with, and get right on the edge of that connector and just push it just a little to make sure everything is pushed all the way down. Then we have our power supply connection, our battery connection. Of course, we have the ESN or Dallas chip that we have to put back in place, the USB key, the CF card from the old unit, the old mainboard. And then if the modem was there, we need to install the modem in the new mainboard. And if you'll notice, there is a pin missing there, and our socket is keyed for that pin. And then it just plugs right in. I believe I have everything connected to the mainboard. So we're ready to put our barrier back in. Of course, once again, installation is the opposite of removal. Plug it in. There's only one place it'll fit, so you don't have to worry about which connector. Always put your nuts back on it. Snug them up a little bit. We want to go remove our lockout tag out and then turn the power back on, and the unit should come up and function normally.